So imagine that you are in the foyer of a concert hall, and perhaps you've been dragged there by a parent. Maybe you're just a kid, or perhaps you're the parent who's done the dragging, or perhaps you're just there with a peer, a friend, and you're both super excited to be there. What's happened is the ushers are telling you to come into the auditorium, so you're going into the auditorium, you take your place, and at some point you begin to read your program notes, and it tells you what you have to expect. There's going to be compositions from Bach, straight through to the modernist composer Webern. And so that's all very interesting and exciting. At some point, your attention is drawn to the stage, and there you see that the concertmaster has invited the oboe to play a note. And the oboe's note has been followed by the woodwinds, and then the brass, and the rest of the brass instruments. And before you know it, slowly but surely, all the instruments are playing the same note. It's 440 hertz. It's what we call A in the Western tonal system. And what happens, the conductor comes in to a round of applause, and then there's a general hush as you wait for the music to start. So I started with this scenario because I thought it highlighted quite early on already just how many things can influence how we perceive music. Take, for instance, the fact that you are in an auditorium, so it's a live performance. You aren't just listening to the music, you're also watching it being performed. And we know that actually this can have a huge influence on how we actually hear the music or perceive the music. Another thing to consider is that you've been reading about the music you're about to hear, from who it who was composed by. Perhaps you've also been told what to listen out for while you're listening. So again, you have this top-down information, which we know from research can really influence how you receive the bottom-up information, which is what's actually coming into your ears. But I'd like to start by sort of focusing on something that's even more fundamental than what's coming in through your eyes and what you've read about the music you're about to hear, and talk about actually why the performers actually chose to go through the whole process of tuning their instruments. And you might say, well, it's just so that they play in tune, but this reminds us actually that there's a huge organizing principle in music, which is that we use very specific frequencies out of all the possible frequencies we can use, and that brings us to the notion of a tuning system. So a tuning system is basically a system that defines how we should select specific frequencies out of all the possible frequencies we could use. And in different cultures, we have different tuning systems. Most of them revolve around this notion of octave equivalence. And that's just generally the notion that two pitches are an octave apart if they have a frequency ratio of 2 to 1, and also if they sound similar, the same. And actually what happens across cultures is people take an octave and then they split it in different ways. In the Western tonal system, we split it into 12, and you have 12 notes making the chromatic scale. In other cultures, like gamelan music in Bali, it's actually split into 5 or 7. And what happens is when you listen as a person who's enculturated to one or the other system, it's quite your system. What you're used to hearing seems, perfectly logical. And when you listen to another music in another tuning system, it might sound a little bit foreign or exotic. And that's already going to influence very much how we perceive music. What tuning system has been used to actually compose it. Another important principle is that of tonality. So I sort of threw in the fact that you might be hearing compositions from Bach through to Webern. The emphasis here, or what I was trying to allude to, is the fact that you're going to be listening to compositions from the 1700s and ones in the 1900s. And basically what happened in the 1900s is that these composers often decided to not stick to tonality. So what is tonality? I talked about tuning systems. Tonality is basically the fact that within all the pitches that we decide we can play music with, you can still compose music such that, you often compose music such that it only takes a selection of those pitches once more. So there's a hierarchy of pitches that are used to compose the music, and the idea is that compositions revolve around a tonic, a sort of central tone, and lots of musical cultures exhibit tonality in that they revolve around a central tone. But again, how these tonalities look across different cultures can be very different. And like I said, even within a culture, some composers choose to use it, others don't. What it means is that your perception of a composition that was tonal is very different to one that isn't tonal, because in one case you can make predictions as to how music is going to unfold because you already have this hierarchy. In another case you can't. So having introduced this idea of tonality and tuning systems, I'd like to now much later actually volunteer or sort of give a definition of music perception. And music perception has been defined as just the process whereby we sort of organize, identify, sort of try to interpret musical information so that we have a representation of it, and so that we actually reach some sort of understanding of it. And it happens on a range of different time scales. So we're listening to music now, but we're also sort of still listening to the same music, tens of minutes later sometimes in the case of, multi-movement composition. And so what's interesting for researchers is to try to understand music perception at all these different time scales. So for instance, you might care about what's happening on this scale of like hundreds of milliseconds. What can we actually do with that information? Well, we can decide whether what we're hearing is a violin or a flute. And that's because psychological research has shown that there are different, we have these dimensions that we use to try to distinguish between these instruments. One of them is the attack time, so how quickly the note reaches its full intent. An instrument, when you play a note with an instrument, how quickly it reaches the full intensity of the sound. And so in the case of, let's take a piano for instance, it has a very short attack time. You hear it, it gets loud very quickly, and then it sort of recedes again. Compare that with a flute, where it takes a while to build up to its full intensity. Those two things, the length of the attack time actually allows us to distinguish them. Something else that allows us to distinguish them is basically how much energy there are in the higher frequencies of the sound. It's worth mentioning that any natural sound actually has a fundamental frequency, the lowest, and also a range of other frequencies, what are called partials, above it. And depending on how much energy, how intense those sounds are in the higher frequencies, an instrument can sound brighter or less bright. And again, we can use that to determine whether we're listening to this one instrument or the other. So that's kind of happening very quickly, actually. But of course, we're also, when we're perceiving music, we're also picking out things like melodies, and that may take place over a few seconds. You decide that this is a melody. And how do we represent that? We don't just memorize pitches and say, oh, that's frequency 440, 466. Rather, we extract often just relative pitches and the contour. And so what we care more about is whether the melody goes, notes go up and then up again and then down for a long time, etc. So but the idea is once we have that representation, we can use it as a template or something important with which to sort of keep processing the music that we're hearing. And so we have attention and memory processes coming in when we start to try to make sense or perceive music's long-term structure, large-scale structure. In terms of the methods that we can use to try to understand music perception, basically there's a whole range. You could say, well, I'm just going to do behavioral studies and ask people to tell me what they hear. You could decide to do neuroimaging studies, of course, and try to see what's happening in the brain when you're manipulating certain features of the music. But there's a whole bunch of others approaches you can take. You could say, well, I want to carry out cross-cultural studies because I care about how being enculturated in a tonal system, for instance, influences how you then perceive this given sound. So if we take two people, different culture backgrounds, they've been enculturated to different musical schemes, how do they process this differently? And that can be very enlightening. You could also look at study infants or children, and why might you do that? Well, you want to see how musical perceptual abilities develops over the lifespan, and that's how we know, for instance, that a sort of sense of tonality, those rules guiding tonality, start developing in children about 4 to 7. They start before that, they're actually quite open, and they are actually better at adults at lots of things. But then you could also study across species. That's how we know that rats and actually monkeys have the same ability. And so I guess you could say that research into music perception can really be approached from a whole bunch of different perspectives, and part of the interest is actually bringing together all of these perspectives to try to understand how it works in general. Here's some work I was doing a few years ago. It was looking at individuals with a disorder known as congenital amusia. Now, these individuals will show difficulty recognizing that song I'm singing or maybe humming is Happy Birthday. Now, most of us know the tune Happy Birthday. We've been hearing it since we were 1, perhaps. But these individuals will have difficulty with that. And so we carried out a series of studies to try to understand why that might be, why they have these difficulties. And just to give an idea of what we found, well, the first question was, do they have difficulty learning the structure of the tonal system that they've been exposed to? What we found out was that it wasn't that simple. They seemed to be able to learn the structure of tonal sequences just as well as controls. We then asked, well, are they able to, even if they aren't able to explicitly say that they've heard, a wrong note in a melody, for instance, is it possible that they're implicitly processing it? And interestingly, what we found was that was the case. So they were actually able to recognize implicitly that, this note is more unexpected in that context than the other one, in that context being the melody. And then we did some EEG to show, in fact, the brain is tracking information that they can't consciously report. And so we found out that there was this sort of, the disorder might be one of, conscious awareness of the information that they actually do have. But, that sort of question then opens up a whole new bunch of questions, which in the end, I guess, you have to decide what you study at any one time. But in terms of SRI, I guess in terms of the broader question of, are there any outstanding questions? I guess it depends on where you decide to focus. So I already said how many different approaches you can use to study music perception. Those people who are working on, looking across species will have, tons of questions within that. I'm currently working a lot on emotion and music-induced emotions, and basically there with every experiment that I carry out, there's 5 different follow-up experiments that I need to carry out to satisfy my curiosity.
I think it's quite clear that there are both clinical and theoretical reasons for why it's important to study music in neurodevelopmental disorders. An obvious clinical application is therapy. Speech therapy often adopts aspects of music therapy, especially in trying to fine-tune auditory processing and possibly extend memory in children with developmental disorders. So there is a really direct link between empirical studies and therapy, in that the empirical studies can provide a scientific basis that therapists can use to develop different kinds of approaches to working with these children. If we think about neurodevelopmental disorders, we've got to think about them very much in a different context to the way we would think about adults with brain damage. These children are processing music in an atypical way from the beginning of life. So we might find that these children love music, have an affinity to music, listen to music, but the kind of things that they're encoding about music, the kind of memories that they're laying down may well be different to the kind of memories we'd see in a child who is typically developing. So if we think about some of the cognitive and perceptual mechanisms that are affected in neurodevelopmental disorders, we can see that a lot of those are really crucial for music perception. That children with neurodevelopmental disorders often experience problems in aspects of perception and cognition that are likely to impact on their perception of music. So we see problems with perceptual skills. We might see, for instance, in some language disorders, difficulties discriminating pa and ba. And that's problematic. It might be problematic for discriminating different musical tones. We might see children who've got problems with aspects of short-term memory, of long-term memory. We have problems with sequencing. We might have problems with extracting structures from information. For example, with Williams syndrome, we know these children have problems with pattern perception. And we would well predict that pattern perception is very important for music. And so we're going to see impairments in those areas of music that involve pattern perception. Disorders like specific language impairment, where we see difficulties with language. We can see that we see very, very similar difficulties within music. And this speaks to theories of music that talk about shared resources. So we've got a very important model by Annie Patel in America that talks about how syntax in music and syntax and language share cognitive and neural resources. So the neurodevelopmental research can speak to that. For example, with SLI, the kinds of problems we see in processing syntax, we see during the processing of musical harmony. So that's just one example of how we can take theory forward in terms of music, in terms of developmental disorders. Ideas about associations between music and language. We know that when we're processing emotions in speech and in music, that we rely on very, very similar psychoacoustic cues. And so we can look at that. We can look at whether or not children who are not doing very well at recognizing emotions in voices, and we see that in children who are visually impaired. Are we going to see similar kinds of effects in music? And if we find that musical emotions are very much easier to recognize than vocal emotions, we might be able to use that in a therapeutic context. I think that one of the things that has become much more apparent in recent times is that it's relatively rare for a child to have one neurodevelopmental disorder. So when we look, for instance, at autism, we see lots of children have motor difficulties. So we see lots of developmental coordination problems in these children. We see comorbidity with other kinds of disorders as well. We see language problems. So, for instance, some children with autism have specific language impairment. If we look at children who have visual and auditory impairment, we see fairly high levels of autism. We even see some children with Williams syndrome meeting diagnostic criteria for autism. So we see these very mixed patterns of difficulties in a lot of these children. And I think that we're seeing increasingly a tendency to compare developmental disorders against each other, and that's very helpful in terms of thinking about which factors are unique to this disorder and which factors do we see across both disorders. Okay, so a good example of that is if we look at specific language impairment and dyslexia, we do see a proportion of people who have both disorders, but we do see that those disorders can be discrete and that they have specific profiles associated with them. We have good evidence now that music therapy is very, very useful with autism. So we have good randomized trials showing that music therapy can help with the core disabilities in communication. We also have excellent work from America showing the use of music to elicit speech in nonverbal children with autism. We know that music works to reduce anxiety in some developmental disorders. If we think about what music can do for us, it can do so much because we can use music to help us emotionally. We can use music to enable us to bond with other people when we've got a social communication difficulty. And then if we come right down to the building blocks of music, we can use music to fine-tune auditory perception, which might help with phoneme discrimination, for example. So in that case, having music lessons and learning how to analyse pitches more effectively, generalises to language domains so that we can see some knock-on effects for children that are having difficulties with language. We might be able to use the rhythmic aspects of language to help children with motor impairments. And of course, children that have got problems with motor functioning, if we can motivate that child to start learning a musical instrument, we might very well be able to help the child develop fine motor skills. We might be able to use music as a medium because it's more emotionally engaging. The child might be more willing to engage in what's quite burdensome, practicing hand movements when you have problems in motor skills, in respect to music than in respect to other kind of therapeutic approaches. There's probably a huge amount that we don't know about neurodevelopmental disorders and music. Some groups of children with neurodevelopmental disorders are extremely difficult to test. So, for example, I once carried out a study into emotion recognition with children with Down syndrome, and the children didn't do very well at all. But I don't doubt for one second that these children are extremely responsive to music. I've seen this so many times. The experimental paradigm required the child to listen to the music, look at some pictures and decide which picture matched the music. And the child was much more interested in looking at my face. And it was very, very difficult to get the child to do this. So from the empirical evidence so far, we can't say that children with Down syndrome are totally alive to music, but they probably are. Similarly, children with autism that are intellectually low functioning, I think all the evidence is that they really are very, very responsive to music. But the kind of paradigms we use in psychology mean that we can't really test this very well. We also know that children can have problems with some aspects of music. So, for instance, Williams syndrome is characterised by pattern processing problems, but these children still love music. Are these children listening to music in a different kind of way? Music's rich in timbre, it has pulse, it has tempo, rhythm, all these different components. It might be that not being able to encode melody isn't all that much of a problem, that it's still extraordinarily rich despite these kinds of impairments. And for children with SLI, we're seeing auditory memory problems. We have carried out research showing very poor memory for music in SLI, but we've still seen some emotional effects of music, in that music will prime certain kinds of responses, which does suggest that it's still having some kind of an effect. So again, here we don't have paradigms that are sensitive enough to be able to really show us what's going on with these children. And of course, if we use a paradigm that disadvantages those children because it requires some aspect of tension or memory or motor control, we could very easily conclude that these children are not doing very well, when in fact it's really us that aren't doing very well in terms of developing paradigms that are suitable with these groups. So I think we need to really harness all of our imaginative skills to start thinking about music in these kind of children.
There are multiple different theories about where music evolved from, why we have music in our lives. One of them suggests that music may have evolved to try and help mother-infant communication. And this argues that music developed out of something called motherese. Now, motherese is a way of speaking to babies that we often adopt automatically, that involves strong, high melodic arches, calm patterns, slightly sing-song qualities to it. And the argument is that motherese is easier for babies to understand and therefore helps with communication. Now, certainly we see that babies can actually perceive sounds as early as around 19-20 weeks during pregnancy, and babies have been shown to respond to sounds that they've heard during the womb after birth. And we also see that mothers communicate very well with babies using singing and music. For example, singing to babies compared to speaking to babies leads to stronger visual attention from the baby, less movement, and longer periods of attention. We also find that the mothers themselves feel more emotionally close to their babies when they've been singing with them compared to speaking to them. But in terms of whether there are kind of wider benefits of that, this is something that's been researched quite a bit over the last few years. So what's been shown is that for babies themselves, if a baby is born prematurely, for example, then singing and music in neonatal intensive care can be of real value. For example, it can help the babies to stop moving around so much, so they're wasting fewer calories, so it's keeping them calmer. It can also help them to feed better, which again helps with this calorific intake and weight gain. And this can also build up to them being able to leave hospital sooner. If a baby is born healthily, then we also find that over time singing and music actually help with their language developments. So because music is cognitively easier to process than language if it's kept in these simple melodic phrases, then it can actually help with the development of the brain architecture that then actually goes on to develop into speech. For mothers as well, we also find benefits. For example, listening to music during pregnancy is associated with lower levels of stress and anxiety, and also lower levels of depression in mothers. And there are even suggestions these benefits can last over into the perinatal period, into the postnatal periods. And we also find that mothers who listen to music, for example, during the birth process, actually need lower levels of pain medication, and in some studies have been found to have shorter labour. But post-birth is where I think it gets really interesting, because we're actually starting to see data that are suggesting that listening to music could help the stress and mental health of new mothers. And I've been involved in this with some of my colleagues over the last few years, where we've particularly been looking at postnatal depression. Now, postnatal depression is a very difficult condition to treat. It affects probably around 13% of mothers in the UK each year, but some suggestions are actually that it could be as high as 30%. It's very difficult to tell because many mothers don't contact any health professionals when they're feeling the symptoms. And in fact, many mothers don't even realise that what they're experiencing is any different from the normal tiredness and difficulties and challenges, as well as the wonders of having a new baby. But what's particularly difficult about treating postnatal depression is that many mothers don't take medication if they're breastfeeding, and many mothers also don't have the time to attend counselling or psychological therapies, and they can even feel worried about the stigma of going to these if they're concerned that it's admitting in some way that they're not coping as well as they should be or could be as a mother. So because of this, there's been interest over the last few years about whether community-based psychosocial programs could actually help new mothers and their mental health. And one of the ones that I worked on was looking specifically at singing programs for new mothers. Now, building on the research I mentioned before about the potential anthropological evolutionary basis of singing, there's a theoretical argument for why singing might help. But also singing provides the opportunity for mothers to meet other people in their communities who might be having the same kind of mental health challenges, and therefore find a support group as well. So one of the studies I worked on, we ran a randomised control trial for mothers who had postnatal depression, and they were randomised either into 10-week programmes of usual care, 10 weeks of usual care with weekly social groups with other mothers who also had postnatal depression, or 10-week programmes of social groups with singing involved. And what we found was that whilst postnatal depression does gradually get better over time, we found that the mothers who were in the singing group recovered about a month earlier than the mothers in either of the other two groups. And this is really promising because it's important in postnatal depression to try and help mothers to recover earlier, because we find that the longer a mother has symptoms, the more likely these symptoms are actually going to turn into longer term depression. And for about 25% of mothers, they actually go on to experience symptoms for over a year. But with the singing classes, we were particularly intrigued about, well, why was it the singing but not the social? Because the social groups on their own didn't really have any faster improvement compared to usual care. So we ran some follow-up studies to look at this as well. We ran a qualitative study where we compared the responses from mothers who'd been in the social group with mothers in the singing group. Now, some of the groups reported similar mechanisms, so they said they enjoyed being part of a group with other mothers, having a regular structure in their weeks. But in fact, what we found was for the singing group, there were particular mechanisms that were reported more than for the social group. For example, mothers in the singing group particularly spoke about the benefits they felt of the singing in bonding them with their baby. And we actually followed up on this and did a laboratory study to try and understand this a bit more. So what we did is we actually worked with mothers to take part in a singing session and a social session, and we randomised the order of these. And we looked at what happened to mothers' perceived closeness with their babies when they were singing with them compared to when they were playing or chatting with them. And we found that they were much closer, they reported being much closer after the singing session. But the mothers also had greater reductions in stress hormone levels of cortisol during the singing session compared to the social session. And stress is very much linked in with perceived closeness. And we found there was an association between this reduction in cortisol and the increase in mother-infant bonding. So this certainly could be one of the mechanisms by which 10-week singing programs can be helping postnatal depression. But we also found other mechanisms too. Some of the mothers particularly spoke about the emotional expression that they got from singing, and that this was a benefit for them because it gave them an outlet for what they might be feeling during the weeks. And they also spoke about the immersive nature of the music, the fact it was a very mindful activity that gave them space away from their stresses and worries. And they also spoke about music being a tool, something they could actually use back at home with their babies to help them to sleep or feed or stop crying. And this was making them feel more confident and able as mothers. So it was actually translating back into their broader experiences of motherhood. We also did another follow-up study on this and found that the mothers who engaged in singing programs, they actually start to engage more in music and other aspects of their daily lives as well. So it suggests it's not just about the 1 or 2 hours a week of singing, but it's about how this stimulates other musical activities. So because of these really promising results from this study, we've now been working to deliver this programme to more mothers who've got postnatal depression. In partnership with an organisation called Breathe, we've been working in South London, particularly with mothers who are from more deprived areas or who might be facing additional challenges. And we've been finding that, again, these programmes are helping to reduce their symptoms of postnatal depression. So as we move forward, the kind of big opportunities and questions are, could we actually be offering this as something very simple for mothers all across the country? Many music groups exist in communities already. Could we be referring these mothers into these programmes to try and help with their mental health? Could we even be using this as a preventative thing, so encouraging mothers very early on after birth to start engaging in musical activities for the bonding with their babies, for their own mental health and for their baby's development as well? And also from a research perspective, we're interested in, well, what are the other benefits that music might be having? What about for fathers, for example? Their own mental health needs during the period of fatherhood, the early period of fatherhood, are often unmet as well. So this gives us a really nice opportunity to provide a service that actually fills current gaps in terms of what's provided for new mothers, and also provides this joined up approach between what's offered in terms of health and social care, and also what's being offered by arts and community sectors as well. And overall, what this hopefully suggests is that music could be something we could be promoting amongst new mothers to try and improve their experiences of motherhood.
Right, so the topic of why music, or the question of why music is able to induce such rich emotions in listeners is one that's really fascinated psychologists and neuroscientists for a long time. In fact, it's fascinated philosophers for even longer. In fact, there isn't any one strict definition of emotion in psychology. It's a bit of a bugbear, but most researchers agree that it's basically involves a number of key components. So it involves a so-called cognitive component, which is to do with you evaluating a situation, a context, an event. There's a psychophysiological component, which is basically talking about the fact that your autonomic nervous system may show changes as a result of being in this emotional state. So your heart rate may change, your breathing rate may change, so your automatic nervous system. And there's meant to be a sort of expressive, behavioral, I've kind of packing them together, component where, you know, if you're scared, your face will show terror. If you're angry, you'll similarly have a very distinctive expression on your face. And like I said, behavior. So you might also, act in a certain way in certain emotional states. So there's this idea that, you express and you behave in it shows that you're in an emotional state. And finally, there's the feeling component, and this is probably what most of us in everyday life, think about when we think about emotion. It's like, I feel sad, or it's the subjective report, the subjective experience of the person experiencing an emotion. What we know is that emotions include all of these components. What we then mean by music-induced emotions are emotional states that are induced by, listening to music, and which necessarily have a few of these components. We emphasize the induced because we want to emphasize the fact that it's felt in response to music, as opposed to perceived, as opposed to us perceiving something in the music. And this is an important distinction to make, because often we'll maybe perceive a music as happy, but it doesn't necessarily make us happy. And so this is an important distinction to make, and one that researchers really care about when they look at music-induced emotions. Why would we want to study them? Well, because research suggests actually that about half of our music listening episodes involve some sort of emotion. So one could argue that if you want to get a holistic understanding of emotions in general, it's useful to sort of get a grip, or at least better understand this part of our emotional lives. So when considering music-induced emotions, it's important to also consider how psychologists have, talked about emotions in general. So there are two very popular models, and it's almost naughty to repeat it, because it's sort of the one the psychologists repeat every single time. It's probably not news to anyone who cares a little bit about psychology, but basically it's the basic model, which is just basically that we have these innate universal emotions happiness, sadness, anger, disgust, fear, surprise. And the idea is that across, the world, you'll see people be able to recognize these emotions. This is what makes them so universal and basic. But the question is, how well can they actually account for music-induced emotions? So maybe sometimes you feel happy when you listen to music. It makes you, or you feel sad, somehow you feel a bit more sad. But how often do you feel angry or disgusted? Not often. So the question is whether that would be a good way to think about music-induced emotions. Probably not. Not alone. Another very key model is that of the dimensional model of emotions, and that simply says 2 to 3 dimensions are enough to describe most emotion states. So the one dimension is valence, which is basically how pleasant something is, how it feels. And then there's arousal, and it could be tension and energy, or just plain arousal. But the idea is it sort of is an indication of your sort of the state of your autonomic nervous system, again, how heart rate, breathing rate, that sort of thing. But again, we could say, well, yes, that could, help me tell you about how I feel about the music right now. I feel it's very nice. I feel quite, calm as opposed to, aroused. But again, how much nuance is that in terms of describing what happens when we listen to music? And so what researchers of music psychology have decided is that these are interesting and useful, but not enough. And the trend has been to try to see if we can capture or acknowledge the wide variety of emotions that may be induced by music, and really emphasize the fact that perhaps they aren't the sort of utilitarian emotions that we experience in everyday life. Now, utilitarian emotions are meant to be those emotions that help us adapt or adjust to events that are important to our survival and well-being. Fear, you have to run away from, the thing that's fearful. Often there's no real critical consequences of what we're hearing when we're listening to music. Basically, it's just the form that we're enjoying and reflecting on. And so the idea is that actually with music-induced emotions, these are specific emotions that are of a sort of non-utilitarian nature that are sort of removed from self-concerns. And with that, researchers have gone out and said, well, how can we find out what these are? And they've gone to concerts outside of festivals and just asked people, what did you experience while you were in there? And then you try to see if there are any patterns in what people keep repeating as the emotions they felt. And what's interesting is you find emotions like nostalgia or tenderness, and you'll have something that's close to happiness, like joyful activation has been put forward, for instance. But the idea is that you don't necessarily see the sorts of things we see with the basic emotions. Another interesting trend, actually, that you see in music psychology research on the topic of induced emotions is that people are now stressing not just what emotions you can have, but how they come about, so the mechanisms underlying them. And indeed, one influential paper, for instance, suggested there's about 8 of them. And what I'd like to do is just mention a couple. One of them is, one of these mechanisms is musical expectancy. And this is just the idea that, especially in the case of tonal music, so music that follows these rules, you tend to make predictions about what's going to happen next. We can't help it. It's also the way our brain is structured. And so, of course, when you make predictions, sometimes you'll get it right, sometimes you'll get it wrong, sometimes you'll have to wait to find out what the outcome is. And what we've seen is that people generally enjoy this whole sort of predictive process. And what's more, when you are surprised, when you got it wrong, you have a very distinctive pattern of brain activity that's kind of cares about, getting things wrong and actually physiological arousal. We also see changes in physiological arousal when people get it wrong. So we see that actually this is a real mechanism by which, emotions are being induced, or some sort of emotion is being induced by music. Another mechanism is empathy. So now perhaps most of us think of empathy as something quite social. I empathize with you, with someone. But it's really it's really quite interesting for most people when they find out, people who care about the psychology of aesthetics or music, and emotions, etc., to find out that actually the word empathy came into the English dictionary through the word Einfühlung, which means feel into, and it was all about how we respond to art. And so it's quite interesting to see that empathy is something that actually is now recognized as the way in which emotions are induced in us through art and music, for example, but it was also what people were thinking in those days. And what's interesting is we've seen studies that show, for instance, just generally how empathetic you are in everyday life. If you're just someone who empathizes a lot, this is able to predict the extent to which you'll be moved by sad music, for instance. So you hear a sad song and you'll say, oh gosh, I'm so moved. And it's because perhaps you're empathizing with what you seem to think is the story behind that. Similarly, we've seen that if another type of empathy is not sort of very emotional, but rather a bit more cognitive. So it's a weird thing, it's cognitive empathy. And what people have shown, for instance, is that when you're listening to music that you think has been composed by a real person, or compared to when you think it's been composed by an algorithm, a whole brain network that cares about attributing mental states to other people, reading their mind almost, lights up, suggesting that again, when we listen to music, we can't help but sort of wonder or reflect on what, they might be trying to tell us, or just mental states that perhaps they were in. The work I do, I guess, is sort of more on the brain side. So I care about how the brain's emotion network, areas that we know to be involved in processing emotions, mediating emotions, how they are modulated by simple things like consonance and dissonance, or the surprise that we feel in response to music. And I carry out this research sometimes with a very unique sample of participants, which are people who have to have intracranial electrodes in their brain. So normally we just measure from the scalp, psychology students too often, but sometimes we have access to patients who are willing to take part in our experiments who just happen to have electrodes in their brain for surgical procedures that they're about to carry out. And with that sort of data, we can really get some very fine temporal resolution on brain areas that are that we know they're very deep in the brain, and that we know to be involved in emotions. So that's been sort of some of my research. But in that case, I've tended to use very simple stimuli, the idea being that it's a very rich data set. You use simple stimuli if you can. Of course, we want ecological validity. So in other studies, we've asked people to come into the lab with their own music, and then we've asked questions like, bring in music that, there are moments where you find moments really beautiful. And then we've studied how they describe those moments, how they respond physiologically to those moments, and actually what's happening in the music in those moments. And we've seen some very interesting patterns in terms of sometimes these moments are very arousing, and we see that they report them being very arousing, and then we see that in fact their bodily responses reflect that, and we also see in the music that there are clear structural changes at those moments. And then we have others where they report being very calm, and interestingly we don't see any huge structural changes. If anything, we just see increased smiling, which we think has something to do with the fact that actually it's so easy to process, and somehow they're seeing the beauty in that ease, or sort of processing fluency. And so in those sorts of studies, we're moving away from sort of looking at the fundamentals of features of music to sort of looking at the more emphasis on the experience and trying to understand, emotions in what we hope is similar to what are experienced in everyday life.
So the question how music affects brand perception is a very applied question by its nature. So it's relevant for advertisers, people working in the marketing industry, and also musicians or music consultants who try to sell music to brands to enhance brand perception. So there's definitely a commercial angle to it, and if you kind of know the trick how to make a brand perceived as more interesting or more attractive with music, then that would be a great achievement. And I think there's a long history of using music in commercial contexts and with brands and advertising campaigns. But research only started about 25 years ago, and people have tried in the lab or in experimental settings to pair certain brands or products with music. And music presented with a brand does change brand perception. Obviously, but not all types of music work for all products and all brands, but there's a bit more to it. So you need to know three things. You need to know the values of the brand, or the positive values of the brand that you want to transport. You need to know features of the music that you're going to use, and characteristics of your target audience. So only once you know who you play the music to and who you're advertising to, and what features the music has that may be able to transport the positive values of your brand, then putting these three things together would make for an effective use of music in brand perception and advertising. There have been studies from the 90s that looked at musical fit, so the fit between the music that's being played and the brand that's being advertised, and found very prominently that the better the music fits the product or the brand, the more effective it is in enhancing positive brand perception. So there is this practical line of research in psychology that where people have tried to use different music with different brands, manipulated fit, manipulated contexts. But there's also a whole other layer of research or psychological research that contextualizes these investigations. And it does fit within Daniel Kahneman's framework of biases and heuristics of human cognition, which basically states that in many situations we don't make rational decisions especially in daily activities. So the chewing gum we buy at the till, or the shampoo that we grab quickly from the shelf, these aren't decisions that we think long and hard about, because we don't have to and we don't have the time, and it's not a big investment, and there's hardly anything that go wrong. But especially these decisions that we make all the time and where we don't invest a lot of thinking, they are open to biases and heuristics. So they're often not rational, but driven by contextual factors. And contextual factors can, for example, be associations that we make with a specific brand, or that we recognize a specific logo from previous episodes. And one of these factors that can come into play is music. Music is a stimulus that is good for introducing an emotional context for almost any information that is presented with it. So if a brand or product is presented with music, say on TV or radio or in other contexts, then even though you might not be paying special attention to the music, the music sets a context, so it puts you in a certain mood, it gives associations, it has a style or a genre, or there's a singer, and if it's popular music and you're familiar with that style, it will remind you and you will associate something with it, and these associations then get remembered and committed to long-term memory. And that's very hard to suppress because we don't have any conscious control over the associations that we commit to long-term memory. And then at the point where you're presented again with a brand choice, or the choice between different products, maybe this positive association that was initially triggered by the music when you were first exposed to the brand will come up in that choice situation, and it will just have the effect that you're a bit more likely to choose brand A than brand B, just because it has been presented with music that you happen to like or that comes to your mind in that situation again. So that's a mechanism that describes why music is a very good candidate for enhancing brand perception and why it's particularly useful and effective. And it does creep under the radar in the sense that we can't really suppress it, and it's often connected to an emotional way of processing which is quick and we don't scrutinize it cognitively. And that's different to arguments that are made as part of the message, where, for example, if you state this car is so much more effective in its fuel consumption than other cars. This is something that you can challenge cognitively, where you can compare information with other information, and you can have your own cognitive defenses against that advertising message argument. But that's not the case with music. So if a car ad is paired with, say, music by John Lennon, and you happen to like John Lennon, there's no cognitive defenses that you would build up against that, or you might not even notice that there is an emotional effect of the music on brand perception. Obviously, it's not a silver bullet, and it's usually not massive effect sizes that would sway our opinion or purchase intent from one product to the other. And there are many other biases and heuristics that influence purchasing behavior. The most important one being I buy the stuff that I bought last week and I was satisfied and happy with it. But yet, if it's especially for small consumer products that where there are a lot of purchases around the country all the time, presenting the brand and advertising with music can make a difference to sales, and it can help building up brand perception over time. So emotional brand building is something that doesn't pay off immediately, so a brand wouldn't notice that in their revenues next week, but over time your brand might develop into a premium brand, or a brand that is seen as better or more attractive or interesting than other brand, if you've invested into brand building in the longer term. And then you can actually sell your phone twice the price than a competitor phone that might have very similar technical qualities, just because people want that brand and they're willing to pay a much higher price than would be justified just by the manufacturing price. So in the end, the open questions are, can you automatically identify music that would fit a brand? So for example, can you search music databases with a brand profile and would return a list of candidate tracks that would fit that brand? And that's a really interesting question. And again, developments from music information retrieval might be relevant here, that pick up so-called softer attributes like emotions or mood or human associations that we have with certain types of music, and that we might have in a similar way with certain types of brands. And then I think on an emotional level, the brand and music could be matched even automatically. But what is really important to evaluate whether a particular song fits a particular brand or product. So there should always be empirical testing before a TV ad goes out or a brand decides to sign up to a new music or audio profile or a new sonic campaign, because you never know how, even if you think a certain piece of music fits a brand, you would always need to validate that with the target audience, because your target audience might have a different music taste, might have grown up in a culturally in a different world, be older or younger than you, and it's very hard to judge what these people make of a particular song and whether they think the association between song or music type and brand type is actually fitting and is enhancing the positive values of the brand. And I think that's why it's very exciting and an exciting line of research to look at in the future.
Okay, so music and autism is a really interesting subject, at least in my view, because a lot of the things that we look at in autism are very much to do with the social communication disability and the other kinds of things that we see, like obsessions and rigidity, sensory problems. So looking at music in autism is a way of really getting a much fuller picture of the way that these people function and how they develop over time. I believe it's very important because it gives us kind of an understanding of the sort of emotional and aesthetic qualities that people with autism have. And these are not really very often looked at in this kind of way. If we think historically, autism was first described in 1946 by Leo Kanner. And of course, Kanner laid down the basic principles of the diagnostic criteria in autism. But one of the things that people have not really taken on board was that he did talk about exceptional musical skills in these children, particularly their ability to remember extremely complicated music. And I think subsequently we began to think this was really interesting when we think about it in the context of problems with language and other aspects of cognition. So I think another thing to note that's quite important too is that we've seen a massive change in the prevalence of autism over the last 10 years, 20 years. So we have many more people now with a diagnosis of autism who are intellectually very high functioning. So increasingly we're seeing more and more people who are actually professional musicians, who are performing music at an extremely high level, who do have a diagnosis of autism. The work that I was most interested in was initially looking at tonal and rhythmic perception in music and autism, and the impetus for this was really drawn from musical savants. So musical savants are individuals who have extraordinary musical ability, but often have quite severe impairments in intellectual and language abilities. And we saw in musical savants that they have unbelievable tonal skills. So they have extremely good pitch processing, very extraordinary memory for music, and also skills that are a bit more unusual and unexpected. So for example, we see some composing, we see lots of improvisation, which gives evidence of kind of flexibility and creativity that we wouldn't predict that we would find in this group. So my original studies that I did in the late 90s were really aiming at looking at tonality, rhythmic ability, tonality more specifically, within groups of children with autism that we wouldn't consider to be savants. These children have not had lots of musical training. They weren't showing exceptional musical skills in a kind of accepted sense. But when we carried out empirical studies with these children, we found that they had extreme sensitivity to musical pitch. And then we began to think about these abilities in terms of theoretical accounts of autism. So particularly I was interested in the weak central coherence theory, which at that time predicted that children with autism would indeed be very sensitive to local aspects of stimuli, and this was borne out by them having exceptional pitch. But this theory also predicted impairments in global information processing. And when we came to look at music perception in autism, we found that they didn't have any global impairments. We found that they were processing melodic information, and other kinds of very global aspects of music in an extremely normal way. After that, I became very interested in the idea of the emotion recognition impairments in autism. So the empirical literature very much shows that people with autism are much less proficient than typically developing people at recognizing emotions on faces and emotions on voices. So we then looked at whether or not they would be able to recognize emotions in music. And what we found was that they were recognizing emotions in music just as well as typically developing children. And then eventually we began to think about investigating this in different kinds of ways. So we looked at whether or not we're seeing heightened emotional responses and whether or not we're seeing similar patterns of brain behavior in response to music in individuals with autism. And of course, these studies have been carried out in many labs around the country, especially in Canada. Researchers there have done a lot of this work. And it just seems to be the case at the moment that people with autism are very sensitive to emotions in music. And it looks as though the brain is processing musical information in really a very similar way. I think we're getting evidence now coming in showing that therapeutic interventions using music are highly effective with people with ASD. So we're seeing a range of different kinds of therapeutic approaches that are targeting interaction behaviours, language behaviours, emotional understanding, and they all seem to be yielding very positive results. So I would say that these initial studies looking at musical building blocks, tonality, etc., have developed into a program of research that's shown a very surprising sparing of musical abilities in this disorder. The question that I'm the most interested in is, we know that people with autism are very good at recognizing anger in music, but much less good at recognizing anger on faces and in voices. And what's more, they find it difficult to recognize anger in themselves. So even though they're very aware that they're emotionally very aroused, and they might be able to say, well, you know, I was insulted or I saw someone behaving badly, they won't be able to link that directly to the emotion of anger. This is a disorder called alexithymia that is very, very common in autism. And we've done some work trying to look at whether or not we can capitalize on autistic people's ability to understand emotions in music, to educate themselves about these emotions so that they can then understand them in other contexts. For example, in the context of their own emotional states and the emotional states of other people. I think one of the things that we need to be very clear about is that autism is exceptionally heterogeneous as a disorder. So we see people with autism that are professors of mathematics in prestigious universities, all the way through to people who have no language and, you know, function intellectually at quite low levels. So we have to be fairly wary of making generalizations. But based on the research evidence, which admittedly has mostly been carried out with more able individuals with autism, we believe that they listen to music in ways that are very typical. So for example, we've done qualitative research asking people with autism why they listen to music, what is it about music that makes it attractive to them, and we find out kind of responses we get from them are so similar to those that we get from neurotypical people. So I think I would probably say that listening experiences are very variable in autism, but we can't say that they are different to neurotypical people in one very simple way.
Okay, so musical memory is about how we remember musical elements. That could be songs or melodies or rhythms, and whether there are any rules to this. So whether we remember all songs equally well, or whether there are some songs that are easier to remember than others, and also about how we remember them, what strategies we have, how that's related to musical training, for example, and whether there are differences between people in their ability to remember musical material. It's important from a perspective from general psychology, because if we study musical memory, we study how the mind deals with non-verbal auditory information, and music is a great domain for that, because we can't attach meaning easily to melodic elements or rhythms. They are what they are. You can't easily recode them in verbal terms, for example, or associate visual memories with that. So it's a really good domain to study the human mind and memory in general. And from a musical perspective, it's interesting to understand for music teachers and musical learners how we approach learning music, and is there a good strategy to learn a new song, commit that to memory, play from memory at a performance. How should we do that, and why are certain structures easier to learn than others? So that's the general idea of what this topic is about. I think the study of musical memory, if we leave out the really early history, it started maybe in the 1960s and 70s, when people started within the cognitive paradigm within psychology to run auditory memory experiments. And then, in addition to verbal materials, some auditory psychologists started using individual tones. For example, Diana Deutsch was an important researcher who started researching in the late 60s memory from individual tones or short tone sequences. And most of the musical stimuli were melodies or short melodies of some sort, but they were specially constructed, so they sounded very artificial. Those might have been sine tones generated from a sine tone generator with no rhythm, and very boring music, really psychological experimental music that you wouldn't choose to listen to. But the great advantage of having these stimuli as vehicles was that you could manipulate them, and you would have full control over what people have to study in these experiments, and that then gives you an angle to compare different conditions between simple and complex melodies, melodies that have different types of contours or different patterns of ups and downs, whether adding rhythm would help or would make memory worse, for example, whether there are interference effects between, if you have to remember one tone here and compare it to a tone there, does it matter what series of tones are in the middle, for example? So there were dozens of experiments run and studies published on musical memory of these very simple musical stimuli that ordinary musicians wouldn't even consider music at all. But for a psychologist, it is still a different thing to remember speech, for example. And later in the 80s and 90s, people started using more natural musical materials, so real melodies taken from songs or from classical music, rhythms as they would occur in real music, and also started to compare music from different cultures. So does it make a difference whether I, as a Western listener, need to remember an African song or a Finnish song, for example? Are they easily equal for me, or how much does the experience with a particular musical culture help to remember that particular material? So this got increasingly complex, and there was more input from musicians and musical practitioners in this line of research as well, because the pressing questions were not about artificial short sine tone series, but more about real melodies. And so one of the results that has been replicated a lot of time is that musical contour is something that is really important in remembering novel stimuli. So the pattern of ups and downs in pitch. And that's something that we extract very easily and readily from new melodies that we don't know in advance. In addition, we seem to abstract tonal information, so which key does a melodic series belong to. And then if we have these two types of information, contour and tonality, we are able to reconstruct a melody fairly faithfully if we pay close attention. And that's a theory that J. Dowling published in 1978, the theory of contour and tonality for musical memory, that these would be the two primary constituents, how we remember melodies. Obviously, if you look at more complex music, so a full song or a full symphony, there's also the question where the attention goes. So what elements we focus on, whether we have an analytical ear and really focus on individual musical elements, or whether we are just in a mode of listening where we rather extract emotions, gestures, musical kind of intentional meaning that the performer put into the music. And that might then limit our capacity to process individual elements very faithfully. But in a real world musical listening process, it's often not important to commit everything that we listen to memory. The important thing anyway is to remember that most of these processes work unconsciously. So even if you're not a musician, but you're a normal music listener, you will be able to remember melodies and compare one melody that you heard a minute ago to another one that you hear sometime later. So there's a lot of implicit knowledge that is important in music, and that's a very interesting domain. So you can learn music or understand music and remember music and process music just by being exposed to music and the musical culture. And that's different from many other domains where you need to be taught explicitly, for example, what the meaning of individual elements are. That's not the case with music. And that distinguishes music from, say, learning another language, for example, which you just couldn't do by listening to the radio in an unknown language. And I think these days research has evolved to look at more and more ecologically valid stimuli, so more music as it occurs in the real world. And one of the lines of research that we've been conducting here at Goldsmith over recent years is to take melodies from a large corpus of popular melodies, so pop melodies, Western commercial pop music, as it was released from the 1950s to today, and try to identify features in these melodies to see whether there's anything in the melodies that makes them more or less memorable. So we are not manipulating the melodies, but we're taking them as they have been published, and then try to find associations between these features. Those features could be complexity or the range of the intervals, the distribution of duration values, anything, to see whether these features are associated with how we or how listeners process them cognitively, and then try to explain why some melodies are easier remembered than others. And that this line of research has been successful to degrees. So we did find a set of features that in combination are responsible for a better memory or better memorability, but there's still a lot of unexplained variance in the data. So there's a lot that we don't know, where we don't know why some melodies are remembered better than others. A lot might have to do with an interaction between people, their personal listening history, and the stimulus. So for example, if you've never been exposed to blues music and for the first time you hear a blues melody, then this new structure that you're presented with might not fall into your templates, your learned templates, and therefore you might find this more difficult to remember than others, than other melodies. And this interaction between individuals, listeners, and stimuli is something that I think is worth exploring and that many people try to get at the moment. One thing that's also helping right now is that there are computational tools from music information retrieval and from other areas that help us to describe these or melodies or music in general in computational terms. So we have very clear and precise definitions of musical features that could be relevant for human cognition. And that also gives the possibility to search large corpora of music and melodies for these features. And that again then helps in psychological research to select stimuli that have much of a certain feature or very little of a certain feature, and then we can compare these two sets of stimuli and see how people deal with that and see whether this feature makes a particular difference. So I think, in summary, computational tools, larger corpora of melodies and larger samples of participants and more varied samples of participants regarding their expertise are the three factors that are driving this field at the moment, and that could deliver exciting results and might bring us closer to the question to understand how we remember musical memory, how we remember musical melody. Music can help us sleep, and many people use music to go to sleep. And it obviously depends on the type of music, and it depends on the type of person. And what we found in a large survey that we ran recently is that there are certain types of music that are much better for sleeping than others. Obviously it should be quiet music, calm music, slow tempo, few dynamic changes, and this would help us to calm down ourselves, so kind of power down our physiological reactions and take other thoughts off our mind. And certain people use music more to sleep, so especially the younger ones have more of a habit for using music to sleep, and the ones who are more inclined to music anyway. So if you're a musician or you listen to a lot of music, then you're more likely to use music at bedtime as well. I think it has two effects. One is, it could be a direct physiological effect that, for example, you synchronize your breathing and your pulse to a slow beat of the music, and that way, through this synchronization, you kind of shut down your body and prepare yourself for bed. And the other thing is it might distract you from thoughts that would keep you awake otherwise. So if you then focus on the music or try to understand what's going on in the music, it might take some worries off of your mind. So it distracts you and fills you with positive thoughts that is helpful for finding to sleep. Usually it would be calm music, so you should definitely not try to listen to punk or fast heavy metal music. So anything that's loud, aggressive, fast and has many dynamic changes is certainly not helping. So what many people said is singer-songwriters, for example, who sing in a calm voice, or classical music is mentioned a lot. Obviously there are pieces that are even composed for helping to sleep. For example, the Goldberg variations by Johann Sebastian Bach, who allegedly were composed to help a noble person. So one question is that hasn't been solved yet. Does music help everyone to sleep? So, or are there certain people who don't feel an effect of music? And could you personalize a music treatment for people who might have sleep disorders? So for example, if you know something about the personality and the musical taste of a person, could you put together a playlist that would work for that person in an optimal way? So this would be like a personalized medicine for helping to sleep. The good thing about music is it doesn't have any side effects, so it's much less of a risk than, say, sleeping pills that you could become addicted to. Obviously, you couldn't become addicted to music as well, but that isn't a problem, so it's not dangerous or damaging.
Okay, so my field of expertise is concerning the psychology of music and the neuroscience of music, I suppose. And this is an area that has become rather popular over the last 10 to 20 years or so. The reason that I started doing research in this field is because I was working at the Institute of Cognitive Neuroscience for Professor Ute Frith, who was very interested in how the brain changes as we acquire literacy. And we realised that thinking about musical literacy could give us a way into understanding how a form of notation can change the brain. So I actually started off my research career by looking at how becoming able to read music and play the piano changes people's brain activity. And to do this, I did a longitudinal study taking people who had no idea of how to read music or play the piano, and over 3 months I taught them, and I looked at how the brain responded differently to musical notes before and after training. And I never thought of myself as really studying music and the brain, but it doesn't matter how you think of yourself, it matters how other people perceive you. And following this work, I was offered a position as a postdoc with Timothy Griffiths, and we started looking at more auditory perceptual aspects of musical experience. And in particular, we started looking at something called congenital amusia. And this is a disorder that can be considered to be like a literal kind of tone deafness. So many people say that they are tone deaf, and mostly they mean that they feel that they can't hold a tune very well, that they're a little bit out of tune when they're singing. But congenital amusia is rather different. It refers to an actual genuine perceptual problem where, for instance, people might not perceive very culturally typical songs to be familiar. So Happy Birthday or the national anthem wouldn't be recognised. And if you hear two tunes, to someone with congenital amusia, they may sound like the same tune. So Tim Griffiths and I were very interested to recruit a sample of people who have this disorder, and we used Isabelle Peretz's battery, which is called the Montreal Battery for the Evaluation of Amusia. It's really a battery of tasks where you listen to pairs of tunes and you say whether they're the same or different. And having used this battery on several hundreds of thousands of people that we recruited via the BBC website, we were able to then invite people who scored at the bottom end of the range into the lab, and we did a number of different investigations to work out what seemed to be going wrong in these cases of congenital amusia. And we were asking questions like, what is the fundamental processing difficulty in congenital amusia? Is it a problem, for instance, in hearing a pitch change or discriminating the direction of a pitch change? Is it a problem with pitch memory? Does it extend to problems with intonation in speech? Can people with congenital amusia appreciate music? And are there timbral difficulties as well? So we pursued this disorder on a number of different fronts, and we've published quite widely on that. So some of that research is available for people who want to know a little bit more. That's probably all I'll say about that project, which spanned a few years. But my next grant was really looking at something a little bit different. So from people who have too little music going on in their heads to people who have quite a lot of music, so people who have earworms or tunes in the head. We wanted to know, this was work funded by the Leverhulme Trust, and we were really interested to try to understand why do people have music in their heads, and what determines differences among people. So some people hardly ever have tunes going around in their head, and other people seem to have report that they have a continual musical experience that stems from within themselves. So first of all, what is an earworm? It's a snippet of a tune. It might have lyrics, it might not, it might be classical music, it might be pop music, but it comes unbidden and out of our control. It comes to mind, and then it seems to get stuck and play on repeat in our heads. So this is the phenomenon we're interested in, and we did a few different things. So first of all, we determined whether or not there are intrinsic aspects of a tune that make it more likely to become an earworm. And we were able to do this using some techniques from computational science. It was a collaboration with BBC Six Music radio station. So the Sean Keaveney Breakfast Show has a feature called Earworms, and they ask people to text to say if they've woken up with a tune in their head. And then from all the people that text in, they select one of these songs to play on the radio. So I got in touch with the programme and asked them if they would be interested to share some of these anonymised reports with us. And from this we were able to come up with a list of tunes that were commonly reported as being experienced as earworms. And we were really interested to say, well, what do these tunes have in common? Have they got some structural features in common that might explain why they are more likely than other tunes to come to mind as earworms? And so for each of these commonly reported tunes, we found a control tune that was similar in terms of its chart success, its genre, sometimes even the same artist, but was never reported as an earworm. And then we had these two lists. This list had never been reported as earworms in our sample anyway, and this list was often reported as earworms. And then we were able to use some techniques that my colleague Daniel Mullensiefen has developed to ask what is it that characterises these particularly earwormy tunes. So that was a piece of research we did. And the answer, I'm just simplifying now, is that it's a combination between features of a song that are very expected, but also a couple that are a little bit unusual. So one thing that's unusual and causes a tune to be more likely to appear as an earworm is if it has an unusual contour pattern. So the sort of the pitch interval is a bit unusual, for instance. Anyway, again, we've published on this, and there's lots of details in the relevant publication. We also had a look at people who've we looked to see whether or not differences in brain structure could explain why people would get earworms more frequently than others. And again, we found some differences in the auditory and frontal parts of the brain, suggesting that perhaps in cortical structure can determine whether you're more likely to have an earworm. And this may be to do with things like this strength of connection between the auditory cortex and the frontal parts of the brain, which we know are important in pitch memory and rehearsal processes. One study that we never got round to doing that I'm always very interested to know the answer to is whether or not we can understand the functional importance of earworms. So, for instance, I had this idea that perhaps generating one's own inner music could have an important role in regulating our state of arousal. So you know that sometimes you're in a situation where you need to be in a high state of alertness to deal with the situation that you find yourself in, but actually you're feeling in a different state. And could it be, for instance, that generating this inner music, particularly, if you like, selecting tunes that are particularly up-tempo, if you need to increase your arousal, could this be a way of essentially modulating your own state of arousal such that you're optimally ready to deal with the task at hand? So just in the same way that we deliberately and strategically listen to actual music as a way of either matching or changing our mood and our arousal, it may be that this inner music and our earworms may be fulfilling a similar sort of function in terms of our state of mood and arousal. But it's a little bit of a difficult question to test, and it's something we may get round to in the future, if we can. Now, some of my current projects are really addressing questions about whether or not music can be used in particular situations of health management. So I've recently been awarded a grant from the Medical Research Council and the Arts and Humanities Research Council, and this is a grant that's a very interdisciplinary project, and it involves a collaboration with my colleague Bonnie McConnell, who's an ethnomusicologist, also Paul Ramchandani, who's a perinatal psychiatrist, Vivek Glover, who's a biochemist. This is a very interdisciplinary project, also with my PhD student Katie Rose Sanfilippo. And what we're doing is we are exploring in a particular region in Africa, in the Gambia, in West Africa, whether or not traditional musical practices can be used to support women's mental health during pregnancy. And this is a particularly important area because we know that anxiety and depression during pregnancy doesn't always, but can have biological consequences for the development of the fetus. And this is because of direct pathways in utero between the mother and the developing fetus. So although we're used to paying attention to physical health during pregnancy, it's less usual to ask about a woman's maternal mental health. And so and we know that this is particularly important in low-income countries because these effects of anxiety and depression can be really exacerbated by poverty and associated issues. Now, in parts of the world like the Gambia, there's lots of traditional musical practices that are already occurring where music is used to manage situations of poor health or relationship issues. And we're actually trialling an intervention with 4 antenatal clinics in the Gambia where some groups of musicians called Kanyeleng musicians, these are fertility societies who essentially exist in the community to support other women. We are working with these women to see if a 6-week trial where pregnant women come together with these Kanyeleng groups to sing about some of the issues that they face during pregnancy and to support each other. Can that improve these conditions of anxiety and depression in pregnancy? So that's a very interesting project. Finally, I'll just say a few words. We're collaborating with the National Hospital for Neurology and Neurosurgery, specifically their upper limb service for patients who've had stroke. And we are interested in how we can design interfaces using digital music to really motivate stroke patients to engage with their rehabilitation. So we know that rehab is something that once patients are discharged home, they don't really engage with it. It's very difficult, it's quite boring, and actually we can make use of some of the properties of music, so self-chosen favourite music that can be very rhythmic and entraining. These are very useful properties to get patients to really engage with the repetitions that are required to promote motor relearning after stroke. So I've covered a lot of ground there, but this is a very interesting area, I think, not only to think about how music is processed in the brain, but actually how we can use that knowledge to design approaches to support people's mental health, but also physical health.